Okay, hi everyone in the room and online. Today we have Professor Chris Stokes, who's a world-leading glaciologist based at the Department of Geography at Durham University. His research focuses on glaciers and their interaction with the ocean climate system across a broad range of precipitation and temperature variables, but with a particular focus on their response to global warming. This has led to opportunities to present his work to those that makes up the Conference of the Parties, COP, as well as extensive outreach and engagement activities. So please join me in welcome.
Thanks very much, Amy, and thanks to you guys as well for coming along, those of you online. So yeah, I'm going to be talking today about some of the, not too much detail on the science. I'm going to be saying a little bit about the science that I do around sea level rise. So it's very simple. The Earth warms, ice melts, sea levels rise. But I'm going to just unpack a little bit of the science. And then I'm going to propose that we have a short break. So this is going to be the first part of the talk. I'll say a little bit about global warming and the Paris Climate Agreements, give a little bit of context for that policy arena. And then I'll say a little bit about warming levels, sea level rise, why 1.5 degrees C is perhaps too high a temperature for planet Earth, and I'll just unpack that in a bit more detail. That's based on a recent paper that we published. And then talk a little bit about the solutions, because I'll be honest, this is not going to be a necessarily uplifting talk for you, but it's nice to know that there is a way out of this mess that we're in. And then maybe I'll finish with some scientific conclusions, and then maybe we'll pause and see if anybody has any questions or open it up for discussion around science. And then in the second half of this talk, I'm going to say a little bit about the COPs. You may have heard of the Conference of the Parties and the COPs. You may think you know what goes on there. You probably have a reasonably good idea. I'm just going to unpack what actually happens at the COPs, how it works, and show you some kind of behind the scenes photos of what goes on at the COPs and some of the issues with the COPs, some of the strengths and weaknesses, it's fair to say. And then we can wrap up at the end with a little bit about the most recent COP, COP30, which was in Brazil. And then we'll open it up again at the end for any kind of broader questions and discussion, particularly about maybe the policy, political side of things. So that's where I'm going to go today. I did think I was encouraged to make this interactive. So I do have a couple of kind of polls at various points today. And you should be able to join with your QR scanner. You can also use text as well. This will be completely anonymous, by the way. This software might prompt you to generate a username, but obviously you don't need to do that. You can carry on and skip all of that and just head straight to the talk, to the presentation. But I just thought, I know you're on this kind of course that there's a series of talks, but particularly this topic around kind of warming levels and sea level rise. I just wondered, first of all, just a kind of open-ended question about kind of why you are kind of interested in this topic today. Why are you attending this? What's your motivation to be here, to be listening online, or to be here today? I can see a few responses are coming in, so we can start to have a look at those, hopefully. I'm interested, okay, or tested. I'm bored, yeah. Or maybe some different responses. I mean, see everybody else is going to join in. It's more interesting. Sure, I'll put those open and say it's interesting. As people type in, it's useful for me to know why people are here as well. Yeah. Just get a sense of there, kind of climate change impacts, climate change science, Arctic. I will be saying a little bit more about the Antarctic today. This is great, right? This is good because I'm hoping to touch on quite a few of these. I'm now just going to kind of I want a sense from the room as to kind of how much people know. So here's the next question, which is, according to the most recent IPCC report, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, how much do you think the Earth has warmed since pre-industrial times? And by pre-industrial times, that's the Earth's average temperature from 1850 into 1900. You know, some of you may have had quite a strong education background in climate science and may know this, others less so, but feel free to have a guess and then we'll look at the responses. Look at 2 degrees, 1.2, 2.2. Look at the responses. So that is actually the correct answer, is 1.2 degrees. That's good. I'm impressed. Not quite, thankfully, not quite at 2.2. I can see people changing their answers now. Responded. So move on to the next question then, maybe a bit more tricky. Current policies and action are projected to lead to what level of warming by 2100 of pre-industrial? Yeah, that's it. So there are various options here. We've got 1.5 to 1.9, 2.5 to 2.9. Divergence there. The majority are saying 2.5 to 2.9. Nobody's saying 4.5 to 2.9. So yeah, this is the correct answer, is B there. And so that's the correct answer. At the moment, we're looking at that by the end of century. I'll say a little bit more about that in the talk. But given that warming, how fast do you think global mean sea level is currently rising? Yeah, I'm going to pick up on a lot of these things. Okay, so not quite as much consensus here. But again, this is very impressive. 39% said C, which is the correct answer. So that's what I wanted to jump on a bit. So some people were influenced by each other towards the end there. So yeah, the correct answer is that sea level rise is currently at 4.5 millimeters. And then in terms of what's generating sea level rise, which of the following contributed the most to sea level rise between 1970 and 2018? Melting of small mountain glaciers, glaciers that are in the Himalaya, the Alps, Norway, Scandinavia, the Andes, etc. Greenland ice sheet, Antarctic ice sheet. Was it thermal expansion of the ocean? That's what we actually started to. Sponsors. This is the first one. Correct answer is actually thermal expansion. 16% got right, so if you're in that 16%, well done. But that was a long time period, 1971, 2018, and I'm going to say a little bit more about that in the talk. So let's get cracking. So that's where we're heading. We've done the poll. I want to say a little bit about the context in which POPs operate and this science feeds into them. So the UNFCCC is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and 154 countries signed up to that framework agreement back in 1992. So not all countries, but the vast majority. And that was at the Earth Summit in Rio, which you may have heard of in the context of kind of long-term climate negotiations. And back then, it was the early 1990s, there was a consensus among scientists that climate change was happening, that it was a problem. It just started to impact policy. And so this is what this was all about. And it had an objective to stabilize greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. So we knew back then, a long time ago, 3 decades plus, that this was an issue. And you could argue, well, what's happened since then? Okay, but when it was set up, they decided that we ought to have this mechanism to hold each other to account, to track progress, to get the impacts, to be informed by the latest science. And we ought to do this by getting all of the countries together at one place, and we'll do that once a year, and that will be known as the Conference of the Parties, or the COPs as they're now known. And the COP started in 1995 in Berlin. There was a very significant COP in 1997, COP3 in Kyoto, because you see now that we've got 92 parties, which is nearly all the world's countries. They signed up to the Kyoto Protocol. And again, this protocol was to try and reduce greenhouse gas emissions, greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere. And so we knew what the problem was, again, a very long time ago, and a lot of countries agreed what the problem was and wanted to do something about it. One thing that people don't often realise about the protocol is that it actually ran until just 5 or 6 years ago. There were still meetings, discussions, negotiations around limiting greenhouse gases. But it has been somewhat superseded by the Paris Climate Agreement, because almost just over 10 years ago now, COP21 in Paris, there was a landmark agreement. And, you know, I think at the time, I didn't realise quite how significant this was. The fact that 196 countries signed an agreement to limit warming to 2 degrees C and to limit the increase to 1.5 above pre-industrial times. And you can see the world leaders there from COP21 in Paris. Now, this was a major, major achievement. Okay, that all of a sudden we had consensus that we really wanted to do something about this. But notice also there's a subtle shift between trying to limit greenhouse gas concentrations, which is a kind of thing that is the same all over the earth. You know, wherever you go and measure greenhouse gas concentrations at a certain level in the atmosphere, it's going to be roughly the same. If you think about temperature, temperature is very heterogeneous around the world. So to pluck a number and say 1.5 or 2 degrees is a slight shift actually in what you're asking people to do. And it also means that different countries will be affected in different ways in some ways. So the two are obviously connected, but there was a switch from like, let's limit greenhouse gas concentrations to let's think of a temperature target that we think is going to be okay. And I want to say a bit more about that later. So where are we in relation to the Paris Climate Agreement? As many of you got correct in the poll earlier, the IPCC's sixth assessment report noted that global mean temperatures had increased by around 1.2 degrees since pre-industrial times. This is a plot showing global mean temperature from the 1850s through to present. You can see that 2025 is at the end of the graph. I'm not going to move away from the mic. But 2024 was the warmest year on record, and it was over 1.5 degrees. It was the first time that 12 calendar months had exceeded 1.5 degrees. So the obvious question then is, have we actually already breached the Paris climate agreement lower limit, a more aspirational target, as it's sometimes called? Well, it's a question that people often misrepresenting the media. You'll often see people saying, well, we've missed 1.5, we've gone. We exceeded it in 2024, we've lost that limit. It's actually not quite true because the IPCC use a 20-year average. And you can see here, there are questions in the scientific literature. Well, actually, as we approach 1.5, some might say go past it, how will we actually know when we've reached this crucial warming mark? Well, the answer is that we use a 20-year average, so we've not actually breached the lower limit of the Paris Climate Agreement. What happens is you take a 20-year average, you look back over the previous 20 years, and then if that 20-year period has exceeded 1.5, then we'll say we've breached it. And the year of exceedance is the midpoint. So in a sense, we'll only know we've breached 1.5 10 years in advance of it. So we'll go forward over the next 10, 15 years, we'll get to some point in the mid-2030s, we'll look back and we'll say, yes, we've now exceeded 1.5 for a 20-year average. Oh, and 2029 was when we actually exceeded it. So everybody get them. So there's a slight problem there. A key limitation is that exceedance is only recognised 10 years after crossing the threshold. So from a policy perspective, if you do want to use that target as something meaningful and something that mustn't be crossed, there's a little bit of guesswork about whether we're actually going to cross it. And people in this paper was written to try and come up with a new mechanism whereby you use some computer projections to say, actually, we've crossed the limit now. But the bottom line, you needn't get too sidetracked by this. The bottom line is we will exceed 1.5 in the next 2 decades. That's almost certain, given temperature growth. And at that point, we will say we have now breached the lower limit of the Paris Climate Agreement. And I'm going to come back to that when I talk about what happens at the COPs and how different countries are using and abusing the Paris Agreement for their own ends. So, if we want to get to 1.5 compatible, which is the green line here, you can see there is a huge, what we call emissions gap. Yeah? At the moment, current policies and action are taking us somewhere between 2.5 and 2.9 degrees. And well done to those of you who got that answer correct. That's where we're heading for at the end of this century. That's the blue line here. And actually limiting warming to 1.5 requires immediate, drastic, deep emissions reductions. And there is a huge gap at the moment between what we need to do to kind of reach that, get back on track with 1.5 compatibility. I will also allude to this a bit later on as well, because I think we're entering a very interesting period from climate science, from climate policy. In that black line of historical emissions, we're really hoping that in the next 10 years we will peak. It's got to happen, right? Yes, we've got to go down even sharper, but it'll be really interesting to watch whether we do manage to bend that curve in the next 5 to 10 years to stand any chance really of even getting to this kind of 2.5 to 2.9 limit. So what does this global warming mean in terms of sea level rise? Well, again, congratulations, those of you who got the question right. Sea level, worryingly, is now rising at 4.5 millimetres per year, so nearly half a centimetre per year. And that has doubled, that rate of change has doubled over the last 3 decades. But what I find interesting is that even under current warming of just 1.2 degrees, according to the IPCC's 20-year average, sea level rise is accelerating. And actually, if this red line continues, and it's not absolutely certain to continue at the same rate, but it's very, very likely to. What that means is that at 2100, sea level is rising at 1 centimetre per year. But that means that if a child is born around that time, sea level will then rise 1 metre in the century that they might be alive. So we're approaching some very rapid rates of sea level rise, which I think is just not appreciated in as much as it should be in the climate dialogue. I think, you hear lots and you read lots about climate change. You hear people saying it's going to be good. We're going to have vineyards in southern England or expansion of vineyards, etc. But actually, this is one impact of climate change that is pretty much immediate. It's very direct, and it will alter coastlines around the world. And I don't think it enters into the discussions around climate change as much as it should. A rate of 1 centimetre per year is very difficult to adapt to. Effectively, your only adaptation mechanism is actually to move people inland. So where's the sea level rise coming from? This is a useful plot that was back in the IPCC report in 2021. If you look at that period from 1971 to 2018, thermal expansion of the ocean, particularly the upper ocean layers that are warming the most, they dominated contribution. They're about half sea level rise. That's just the thermal expansion, the warm water expanding as it warms. Melting of small mountain glaciers and the ice sheets in Greenland and Antarctica together are about 42%. And then there's this slightly strange orange colour at the bottom called changes in land water storage. So this is really difficult to measure, and it's often forgotten about, but it's essentially the balance between, are we building lots of reservoirs and therefore keeping rainfall on land and not allowing it to go into the ocean? So that would be good, because it would have a negative impact on sea level rise. You know, we're keeping the water on land rather than putting it into the ocean. Or are we, as takes place quite a lot in this part of the world, taking water out of the ground from groundwater storage, using it for some purpose, and then putting it into a river, which then goes into the ocean? So water abstraction, particularly groundwater abstraction, is a really powerful way of taking water that should be locked up on land and getting it into the ocean. At the moment, we think, you know, there was a growth of reservoirs in the early 1900s, and they've actually stopped building so many reservoirs now. And actually, groundwater abstraction is dominating over the building of reservoirs, so therefore it's having a positive impact. But it's a very small component compared to the others. So this is your kind of plot of what's contributed to sea level rise. Also note from this graph that there is a gap between the observed sea level rise, which is in this dashed line, and actually our sum of the components. So another thing that we're very good at measuring sea level rise. We can do that really easily, very simply, but we're not very good at trying to add up the individual components and match it. So some things are, if you like, our estimations and calculations of melting land ice, maybe there's something we're not quite doing right. It's happening a bit more quickly than before. We're not capturing our calculations. Now, we talked about small mountain glaciers, the ones that you might visit if you go walking in the Alps or on holiday to Iceland, or you've been to the Himalaya, the Andes, Patagonia, etc. They're what we call small mountain glaciers and ice caps. It's about 275,000 of them. But actually, if they all melt tonight, we'd wake up tomorrow morning with sea level will just be about 30 centimetres higher. Okay. What we're really worried about when it comes to melting ice are the big, what we call ice sheets that are in Greenland and Antarctica, because they store 65 metres of sea level rise. That's what's locked up in the Antarctic ice sheet and in the Greenland ice sheet. And I've just put them on this map of Europe here so you can see the side. So if all of that ice melted, we raise it by 65 metres. And I'll make you clear that's not going to happen. It's not imminent. But you can see the UK coastline there with 65 metres of sea level. So even if we just lost 10%, 6.5 metres of sea level, it's still catastrophic. Not just for people who live in coastal areas, but for some entire countries that will be underwater. 6.5 metres of sea level. And what's really worrying is that in the last decade or so, the contribution from Greenland and Antarctica is now larger than for mountain glaciers. So the small glaciers dominated that cryosphere, the frozen sea level rise over the last century or so. But now Greenland and Antarctica have caught up and they're now contributing more. So we are really worried about what's happening in Greenland and Antarctica. This is the kind of partitioning of the ice. We've got 7.2 metres in Greenland, 5.3 metres in what we call the western part of Antarctica, and 52 metres in the much larger eastern part of Antarctica. And what I'm showing you now is some satellite measurements, kind of research that we do using satellite imagery. We can actually weigh the ice sheets. There's some satellites, very small mission, and they actually weigh the gravitational pull of the ice and convert that to mass. And what you can see here is that kind of seasonal fluctuation. Greenland, on the orange line going up and down, little bit of interannual variability in Antarctica, not so much. But what you see on the maps is areas in red are losing mass. And in places we're slicing off somewhere like 5 to 6 meters of the surface of these ice sheets every year. We're actually losing around, on average, actually over 400 billion tons of ice a year from Greenland and Antarctica. And 370 billion tons is like millimeters. So these things were really worried. There's a major acceleration, particularly in Greenland, as to what's going on here. So, with this in mind, a few of us got together and wrote a paper last year where we said if you look at what's happened at just 1.2 degrees of warming, and if you look at what's happened to Greenland and Antarctica, it's very clear to us that even 1.5 is too high for the polar ice sheets. And this was a tough message to sell, right? Because we've been saying over the years that 2 degrees, ideally 1.5, and then a bunch of scientists come along and say actually 1.5 is too high. And our conclusion in this paper is actually that we should be aiming somewhere like 1 degree. So we have to actually protect coastlines from sea level rise. And I was expecting quite a few kind of emails to come into my inbox when we publish this work from other scientists saying you're being too pessimistic, it's too early to say, etc., etc. But actually, I didn't get a single email. And so I think what's happened in the last year or two is that there's been an increasing recognition that actually, when it comes to sea level rise, we've almost gone past where we need to be. But there will be some hope, I can assure you. And another reason we're quite confident in this message, and don't need to table too much, there's lots of information there, I'm just going to pick out some key things. But one of the reasons we're quite confident is that in that paper, we went back to some past warm periods. We looked at some times when global mean temperature was either similar to today, slightly cooler or slightly warmer. So one of those times is what we call marine isotope stage 5e. It's about 25,000 years or so ago. But what this tells you is that just 287 parts per million of carbon dioxide, and with a global mean temperature of 1 degree C, see at the bottom there, we've got 2 to 9 meters of sea level. So currently, CO2 is at 420 parts per million. This is really worrying. We can go back a bit further in time to about 400,000 years ago. Again, CO2 much lower than today. Global mean temperature, we think somewhere between 1 and 2 degrees. And we've got sea levels that are 6 to 13 meters higher. If we go back even further to maybe 3 million years ago, we did have CO2 levels that are slightly higher than today, the global mean temperatures that were higher than today, and we get 10 to 20 meters of sea level. So these records from the past clearly tell us that if you just nudge up the Earth's thermostat by 1 or 2 degrees, you get several meters of sea level rise. And this actually is not new. This was in the IPCC report, but the notion was that we'll get 2 to 9 meters is locked in over millennial timescales. I.e., it's not the absolute number that matters, it's how long it takes to get there. We can cope with 2 meters of sea level rise if it's going to take 2,000 years. If it's going to take 200 years, it's a big problem. So we also need to move away from thinking about sea level rise as an absolute number and perhaps focus more on the rate of change, because the rate of change will determine how easy it is to adapt. And I think what's moved on in just the last 5 years since the IPCC report was published, and there'll be another one coming towards the end of this decade, 28, 29 maybe, is that the fear is that this 2 to 9 meters or 6 to 13 meters is going to happen much more quickly than we previously thought. That's what the fear is, that the big ice sheets are starting to do things that we didn't think they'd be doing for another century or two. And I say, when I look at the literature that's coming out, there's a growing body of evidence now that this current warming level of just 1.2 degrees is sufficient to trigger what we sometimes refer to as ice sheet collapse, a very rapid melting of the ice sheet that leads to very rapid rates of sea level rise. And you can see that this kind of collapse, people are saying, is potentially already underway. There's a whole bunch of papers now coming out talking about unavoidable future increase in sea level, tipping points. Present day mass loss are a precursor for West Antarctic ice sheet. So we're on the cusp of something dramatic, we think, quite happening. Lots of papers coming out about long-term commitments, the fact that we've passed thresholds, we've passed tipping points, and that actually cooling may not be enough to stop some of these processes happening in Antarctica. Because these ice sheets have tipping points whereby once you destabilize them, they'll melt very quickly, they'll destabilize very quickly, perhaps in a few centuries or a few decades, but it will take thousands of years to put them back to where they were. It's this hysteresis behavior. And I think another really interesting observation, which again, I don't think has been widely appreciated in some circles, is that when you look at those tipping points that, say, Greenland and Antarctica might have, our knowledge of them has improved and the temperature thresholds have lowered. So you can go back to a paper published in 1994, so not too long ago, and people thought it would take 17 degrees of warming to destabilize East Antarctica. We now think it's as low as 2 degrees C. So I've put a little red arrow on our global mean temperature graph of when we're going to kind of approach that threshold, bearing in mind that 20-year average. Greenland, we used to think it was 3 degrees, then 1.6, then 1.5, and in most recently, we're thinking it might be as low as 0.8. So we're well past 0.8. And then if we go to the western part of Antarctica, again, thought to be around 1.5, could be as low as 1 degree C, but people are now suggesting in a report that was released just before COP30 that a precautionary principle of 0.5 would be appropriate. Again, we've crossed that quite some time ago. That's why we are in the temperature. So, you know, my fear is that, you know, as we uncover more, we get more measurements, observations, all these temperature thresholds go down. Well, we can't go down much further, really. But this is something that I'm very concerned about. But if we look at the headline, then, you know, how does the IPCC treat this science? Or how did it treat it back in its latest report? Well, it had its main scenario pathways on the bottom there, out towards the end of the century. So the best case scenario was we're looking at about half a metre of sea level rise by the end of the century. The more aggressive emission scenario, SSP 5, 8.5, you're looking at about a metre. But look at that dashed line. That dashed line represents what we call a low likelihood, high impact storyline, which includes some of these ice sheet instabilities that I think we've started to see unfolding in particularly West Antarctica. And buried away in the IPCC report then was the sentence that actually we cannot rule out 7 to 14 meters by 2300. That's the right of that. 2 or 3 centuries time. And the interesting thing is that over a longer time scale, even one of the best case scenarios, the emissions track that we're on at the moment, SSP 1 2.6, which leads to about 1.8 degrees of warming by the end of the century. Even the kind of likely range shaded in blue, just that we could have over 3 meters, a meter per century, and that's that rate of change. So this is really concerning, and again, I don't think this is something that's always widely appreciated. What does it look like on the ground? Well, these maps now show you the land that's inundated for a given amount of sea level rise. Globally, 230 million people live within 1 meter of sea level. I think most of the world's large cities are coastal. 1 billion people live within 10 meters of sea level. This is, you know, I showed this map back at COP because we were in Belém. This is showing you on the edge of the river delta, the areas. Obviously, a river delta is likely to be inundated. But we can go to other parts of the world and see different places. This is Guyana, Suriname, there's a whole coastline there. We can go to West Africa as well. We could go to Papua New Guinea, and this is Tuvalu and even China as well. So Tuvalu is a low-lying Pacific island that will be completely underwater for some of these sea level rise scenarios. And we're already seeing international agreements taking refugees from some of these small island states. Australia, for example, agreements like recent events. 0.7 meters is well within the likely range for this part of the world where we are at the moment. And this is kind of what we're heading for, and this is what you'll see in this part of the world, with just 70 centimetres of sea level rise, which is slap bang in the middle of that likely range that we're heading. This is by, you know, this is what we look like. We could be reaching this by 2100. Again, it puzzles me that this isn't talked about more widely. So just to kind of end and wrap up this first part, what is the solution then here? Well, one thing that's been quite controversial actually, and somebody said to me a few years ago, there's going to be a civil war breakout in glaciology. Yeah, because there are some people now saying that actually our only hope is to interfere with the ice sheets and to try and do something to stop the flow of ice from the ice sheets into the ocean that's contributing to sea level rise. But one of the solutions that's been proposed are these sea curtains that you anchor to the seabed, and it's buoyant, so it lifts up on the ocean floor and it stops warm ocean currents melting the underside of parts of Antarctica. And there are huge logistical issues, there are huge financial issues, there are also ethical issues, there'll be knock-on effects to ecosystems, etc., etc. But actually, fundamentally, even, you know, I'm happy to kind of set those aside. It just won't work because the ocean heat just ends up going somewhere else. And also, what we know from ice sheets is if you slow flow in one place, it's just like damming a river, right? You can dam a river, it keeps raining, the water piles up, and then it flows up in another direction. It's the same with ice sheets. We see this. We see it over long time scales. Plus the fact that there are actually hundreds of outlet glasses around Antarctica, you can't possibly do this for all of them. So I think, you know, this started to be proposed. People kind of ignored it, but actually a few of us got together last year and wrote this paper that, you know, read if you want, which actually kind of tries to kind of objectively assess some of these proposed ideas. And all of them fail on some essential criteria about feasibility, finance, ethics. But for me, it's just the very fact that the science doesn't work. The other thing that's been proposed is that you can set up a drill site on the ice sheet bed in Antarctica. You can suck water from the bed because that's kind of lubricating the sliding and allows the ice to flow into the ocean. And you can somehow pull that water out, and that will mean there's more friction and it will stop flowing towards the ocean. And you know, there's a little bit of science behind this. We know that the distribution of water at the bed is really important. We know if it gets to freezing point, it really does slow the ice down. But we don't know where some of these subglacial streams are. So it'd be like kind of, you know, trying to pin the tail on the donkey, so to speak. It would be almost impossible in Antarctica to know exactly where some of these streams are under 2 kilometers of ice. And even if you hit one of them, you might depressurize it. It's going to be taking a lot of energy to get it onto the surface. And then what do you do with it? And dump the mass somewhere, and that redistributes the mass. But also, we know that these systems of the ice sheet, they're like graded streams. They're moving around all the time. And actually, you know, we wrote in this paper back last year that, you know, even if you stop one of these ice streams by freezing it to the bed and taking the water out, what you'll probably do is build up the ice, and then you'll see it will surge. It will build up so much mass, and then it will surge off in a different direction. And I was at a conference just 2 weeks ago where somebody had actually started to model this process of melting the glacier, and that's exactly what happened. They did an experiment where they all of a sudden increased the friction of flow, and the ice started like pulsating, and then they had to like keep putting these drills in to try and stop the water all over the place. So it just got a bit ridiculous, to be honest. So I don't think these are solutions. But actually, one thing that was written up just before COP, it was timed to come out before COP last year from the Climate Analytics Group at Potsdam University. They came out with this new scenario, rescuing 1.5. The recent work shows warming can be halted within the next 15 to 20 years, and it can even return to below 1.2 degrees. This is just a headline from the report showing the graph. Okay, so the red lines are what was in the IPCC report, and kind of we haven't started to bend the curve, so that's kind of gone, that red scenario with the dates. But they're saying there is a blue curve that is still possible. It's still possible. Now it requires, you could argue, governments to do things that we know they're not going to do, but it is still possible. This is not make-believe. This is not asking for something that is feasibly, you know, just simply implausible. This is possible. And, you know, if you read the report, it clearly requires the rapid phase out of fossil fuel use. It does involve some scaling up of carbon dioxide removal. And it's underpinned by this kind of, electrification of our lives. Everything that we do run by electricity, which is then sourced from renewables. But I do think this offers a little bit of hope. There's a roadmap of what is possible, and we obviously get that later. But what's very clear is that we're now talking about what we call overshoot scenarios. 1.5 sadly has gone, or at least it will go in the next 2 decades. But there are solutions here that will see us come back down. So I'm going to actually finish with some scientific conclusions, and then maybe we'll pause a short break and have some questions, and then I'll wrap up with some photos and thoughts. But ice sheet contributions to sea level rise have quadrupled since the 1990s. They were in balance in the 1990s. We were measuring them. Snow was falling on them, ice was leaving them, but they were in balance. They weren't contributing to sea level rise. But in just 40 years, their contribution to sea level rise has quadrupled. And because of that, largely driven by the ice sheets in Greenland and Antarctica, sea level rise is accelerating to rates that are going to be very difficult to adapt to in the lifetime of our young people. If you're still living at 2100, sea level could be rising at 1 centimetre per year. You might be telling children that they've got to adapt and meet up with their lifetime. So policymakers, my message is always that you need to start preparing for several meters of sea level rise over the coming centuries, but we still have agency because we still have the power to determine how high and how fast that rate of change will be. If you take this to its logical conclusion, slowing sea level rise from the ice sheets actually requires us to cool below present day temperatures, because present day temperatures have led to these changes. So clearly we need to have Earth in a cooler climate state to somehow try and slow down or even stop sea level rise. But as the new climate analytics modelling shows, this is still feasible under what they describe the highest possible ambition scenario. So if you're interested in kind of how you go about that, there is quite a detailed report saying that this is still feasible. So I propose that we stop there, and I'm happy to take any questions about any of that science, and then we'll move into the kind of the last third of the session, which will be very much focused on the comms. Thank you. So the question was kind of turning it around to kind of geopolitics and maybe some of the geopolitical implications of melting ice, particularly in the Arctic, particularly in terms of resource extraction, rare earth minerals, and also I'll touch on shipping routes as well. So particularly in the Arctic, less so in the Antarctic, which is governed by the Antarctic Treaty, there is a lot of news at the moment, particularly around Greenland. Greenland, most of the island of Greenland is covered by the Greenland ice sheet, which, as I said, is about 7 meters of sea level equivalent. There are rare earth minerals there that people would like to get their hands on. There are also oil and gas not too far away around places like Svalbard and the Barents Sea. One thing I haven't talked about is actually the seasonal freezing of the Arctic Ocean, which is what we call sea ice. And there's a sense that, it might be a good thing if the sea ice melts in the Arctic, because then we can take ships through the Arctic. So it's much shorter, for example, to go from Singapore through the Arctic down to, say, Rotterdam than it is to go all the way around the kind of southern route, so to speak. My reading of a lot of that situation is that it's kind of overhyped. It's a very easy story to write in the media. Actually, the Arctic is a relatively well-managed space. There is something called the Arctic Council, which is essentially formed of the 8 states that have territory inside the Arctic Circle. And indigenous groups are also permanent participants on the Arctic Council. And actually, if you look at it, you could flip it around and say that it's actually one of the more well-managed parts of the world. You know, there are the United Nations Convention of Law of the Sea, which manages how you can extract things. I think some of the hype around kind of wars breaking out over Arctic resources is a bit overhyped. The flip side, of course, is that we've seen very well publicized, you know, attempts. So, for example, from Donald Trump to kind of somehow, you know, seize Greenland. And there are reasons for that, right? He's not doing that because he wants to preserve the ice. He wants to rare earth minerals. But it's incredibly complicated. My short answer to your question is I think it's a little bit overblown. There's not this political scramble for the Arctic that you always read about. But who knows what might be in the future. We can maybe come back to that after the second one. I think for me, so yeah, the question was about, you know, I talked about a couple of called geoengineering possibilities to do, particularly interfering with the ice sheets, slowing the flow of the ice. The question was about kind of, are there other fixes like what we call solar radiation management, where we put kind of reflective particles into the atmosphere to try and reflect kind of radiation. And it's not a field of research that I work in, but we did cover it in that paper actually. And again, there are some quite worrying side effects from cloud seeding and putting sulfates into the atmosphere. It will adjust rainfall patterns. It could cause flooding. It will obviously be transboundary. So how do you even set up political agreements where one country is like, well, we're going to do this, but you're going to get loads of rain over there. It's also one of those fixes whereby once you've done it, it's very hard to stop, right? It's not really a solution in the sense that as soon as you then stop putting sulfates into the atmosphere, trying to kind of manage the solar radiation, as soon as you stop it, you just go back to where you were. But my approach to these things, we actually know what the solution is, right? The solution is to try and decarbonize as quickly as possible. I know that is challenging, and I very much take your point that economies are reliant on it. But actually, it's not, I don't think it's as difficult as we might think. Again, this is something we can come back to at the end once we've gone through the COP slides. But there are countries that at the moment that are heavily reliant on fossil fuels. Think of Gulf states, for example. They're countries that are really well positioned for solar energy. They get sun like 12 months of the year. Okay, there's complications with sandstorms, etc. But weaning them off the big fossil fuel industry is what's difficult. So I think we'll probably come back to that question. Local solutions to change the albedo. People have tried it with small glaciers in the Alps. They put like reflective covering down, try and preserve a ski slope, for example. They can work at a very local scale, but they're not a solution for losing ice. In relation to geoengineering. Yeah, so I think that the question was about would countries ever be able to agree on geoengineering? I mean, I think The Antarctic Treaty, as it's currently set up, would actually prevent a lot of these issues on environmental grounds and ethical grounds. So there's already agreements anyway about the protection of Antarctica. They don't exist to the same degree in the Arctic, actually. There is no Arctic treaty. The Arctic Council manages that space, and international law of the sea manages, to at the moment keep a lid on things like that in the Arctic. How that might change in the future, it's anyone's guess. In theory, yeah, you could get the 8 Arctic states to agree. We want to start putting glass beads on the ocean to try and refreeze it and maintain sea ice, which has been suggested as a possible solution. Possibly. I think you'd need to get indigenous groups involved as well and make sure that they're okay with it. But I'll come back to the point. If you go read the Seagird's-Tell paper, which was written by 40-odd authors, and looking at very objective criteria, most of them failed. Most of these climate intervention, climate repair, dressed up in different guises, actually just a simple word work. And you could say, that geoengineering is a blunt term, right? Afforestation, growing forests, is a form of geoengineering, which suck out CO2. So that's a very, I have no problem with people, preserving, protecting forests, growing more forest to try and suck out more CO2. But when I think those unforeseen circumstances and knock-on effects, that's when I think we're going to go dangerous. Okay, should I press on with the second half of the talk? Okay, so I'm just going to spend a bit of time talking a little bit about the COPs, how they work, who goes, what they look like, what goes on there, and some of their strengths and weaknesses, just in the last kind of 20-25 minutes or two. I did have a quick poll actually as well. Why not? It's that great. These. Yeah, again, just to get a kind of sense of breathing. Yeah, I know when you think of the climate negotiations, and sick. Yeah, some very good points there, some of which I will pick up on. Absolutely. Couple more. Again, just to kind of get a read of the room. International climate negotiations, for example, the COPs have proved largely ineffective in combating climate change. We'll see if your mind changes in the next 20 minutes or so. Another question then. Without international climate negotiation, the level of warming at 2100 are worse. Objective. I think general sense is that actually if we hadn't done anything about this, we would be looking at about 40 degrees about 100%. So we used to talk about a business as usual scenario that would take us to about 40 degrees by the end of the century. Actually, now, as I say, we're looking at some really good things. And then this is kind of another one that just touches on some of the discussion we've had. Actually, I realised that this will come along so early in today's discussion. Climate change is becoming so bad that I'm open to the idea of interfering with the climate system. Geoengineering solutions, even as a short term. Just something that was just rising up profile. I don't think you agree. Skip that. Yeah, I mean, I think had we done that 10 years ago, it would have looked quite different, maybe. But maybe I'll just guess. Okay, so I want to say a little bit about the COPs, and I don't know how much you know about the COPs, so I'll give you a bit of basic information on the layout. So as I said at the beginning, the Conference of the Parties is attended by the parties, that's the states, but it's also attended by observers, so that's people who are allowed to go and observe the process and lobby and contribute. And then media are also a big presence at the COPs, and together with two slightly strange groups of people called Party Overflow, which sounds far more exciting than you might think it does, and other staff. And what you can see from the bar chart below is that the first 20-25 COPs were mainly attended by the parties and the observers. Observers, by the way, they could be NGOs, they could be specialist organisations, Wildlife Fund for Nature, scientific institutions, research, meteorological office, etc. So scientists would represent observers there alongside them. But what's happened is that parties have been given a few more tickets, if you like, they're referred to as badges, to allow other people to go along. They issue these tickets. And one of the things that's been really well publicised is that those party overflow tickets have often been given out to people who wouldn't necessarily want to be at climate negotiations, such as the fossil fuel industry. So there's been a lot of controversy, particularly in Dubai, you might remember, but also in Azerbaijan, that the fossil fuel industry had larger delegations at COPs than quite a lot of the countries. And they were there because this party overflow. Essentially, the people running the COP who get the most tickets, like the Azerbaijan government, government, had given them tickets to get into the venue. And it's interesting that Dubai was absolutely huge. I've put the 4 COPs, the last 4 COPs. These are the 4 that I've been to. My first one was in Egypt, 7, and the UAE, Azerbaijan, and most recently in Brazil. Dubai was absolutely huge. It dropped back down from Azerbaijan at COP29. And then people thought Berlin, essentially on the edge of the Amazon rainforest, it's a relatively small city to host a COP. There was nowhere near enough population available, and it was very expensive to get to. And there was huge concerns about accessibility. In fact, that people couldn't afford to go. Even some of the least developed countries couldn't afford to go. They were inviting countries to bring their own cruise ships along and use them as accommodation. But actually, it still ended up being the second largest COP ever. And we'll talk a little bit more about that towards the end. Notably absent from the last COP with the USA, that's very well publicised, and then you can see that also absent with Afghanistan, Myanmar, and San Marino. So the vast majority of countries will send a delegation. Sometimes if you've got more pressing domestic issues to the country, you won't always send them. And a country's delegation could be several hundred, or it could just be 10 people, or 10 negotiators, and a minister, or will go to the COP. And Durham University has held observer status since COP26, so that means that we can apply for a very small number, typically somewhere between 2 and 4 badges, that are then shared out amongst people at that university who might have a good reason to go to COP. Say a bit more about what actually goes on there. Here's a general kind of layout. They're a big convention centre. You'll have an entrance. When you walk into the entrance, you go to an area called the pavilions. I'll show you what pavilions look like, but essentially they're like mini houses that each country sets up and runs a series of events. I'll show you what they look like in a second. You'll have side events that take place, all kinds of different announcements, information sharing, countries wanting to publicise what they're doing in a side event. And then you have obviously lots of negotiation rooms and some media. And this is called the blue zone. And this is like a UN secure zone. We've got airport style security. And then just outside that is usually what's called a green zone. And the green zone, anybody can go to. It tends to be a bit more kind of people who are there to protest, people who are there to lobby, but who haven't been able to get access to the main venue. So a lot of good stuff goes on in the green zone, and absolutely anybody can attend, but the actual COP itself will be obviously restricted to those who have a badge. And usually, there are protests allowed around COPs. Very much depends on the local government stance and whether they allow it or not. So this is a fairly tame protest wall, if you like, outside COP27 in Egypt. You may remember that in the most recent part of COP30, there were a lot of concerns about protests. And you can see here now they've got the army on guard. Now, despite that, you may remember that quite early on at COP30, people actually managed to break through the venue and got inside the venue. So this is the kind of the entrance to COP30. And within a few days, protesters have got into the venue and, caused a bit of a brouhaha. Thankfully, nobody was seriously injured. I thought this was brilliant, I should add. A bit of emotion, a bit of anger was really, really good. It landed in two very different places with the people there. Some people said, this is great, but actually we're here to negotiate. The whole venue was evacuated for like 8 hours after this. And then there was some concern about when it was going to be open, and everyone was kind of feeling safe, and there were rumours that somebody had been injured and shots had been fired, and all these kind of rumours circulating and very kind of disrupted. And some people were very angry and cross, and we're here to negotiate. Other people were like, this is brilliant, this is fantastic, it's exactly what I want to see. You can see emotion, you can see anger. People need to know the strength of feeling that's out there. And I kind of fell into that camp. But it did mean for the rest of the week at COP30 that we were kind of walking through areas. There were tanks, there was helicopters overhead. It kind of put things a little bit on edge. But I just think this photo's amazing. I jumped to position between some of the indigenous groups who were out there protesting, and behind me we've got the riot police. That's fairly unusual. There were more protests at that COP than pretty much any other COP. And they wanted to hold it in the Amazon because of its symbolic significance. And, I think this is part of the course. If you're going to do this, then you should expect people to actually live there and feel strongly about this to show up. This is the entrance to. This is what an entrance typically looks like. You've got a ministerial lane where all the VIPs just sail through, and the rest of us queue up sometimes for quite a long time. I mean, Dubai, it was incredibly hot, 40 degrees. Stood there waiting to queue up and get into the venue. And then once you get inside the venue, these are, in some cases, like small towns. It can take a good half an hour or so to walk around the venue and explore all those different parts of it. Obviously, Expo City in Dubai is kind of probably the best venue you can have for a COP. As you go in, see these entrance areas, and then you very quickly go into what's called the pavilion area. So this is like amazing. You're wandering around. Pretty much every country is represented. Apart from many other places, apart from major sporting events, maybe, but where just the whole world just comes together in this kind of jamboree of it's just incredible. And you can see behind there's the Australian pavilion, and just in the background there's Turkey's pavilion. They were put next to each other here at COP30 because next year's venue for COP hadn't been decided. It should have been hosted by Australia, and Turkey came out of the blue and said, we want to host COP next year. And everyone was like, no, it's Australia's turn. Doing this. Turkey wouldn't back down, and they couldn't reach an agreement. So I thought it was quite funny then that they actually put them next to each other to try and get various dignitaries to talk. Now, you can't read this at all, but this is like kind of like who's there. And if you were able to read this, you've got all the NGOs, non-governmental organisations, you've got the UN agencies, you've got the parties, you've got the international intergovernmental organisations as well. And you can go kind of find them on your map. So if you wanted to go and find the UK pavilion, this is kind of what it looks like. And they're like little exhibition spaces. You know, you get quite interesting neighbours. The veranda next to the Snow Waits here. And this is very late at night. There's not much going on. And this is something that I think is very significant, right? On the right-hand side here, you've got the United Arab Emirates Pavilion, which is like 4 pavilions long. It's like the kind of first-class lounge in the airport. On the left-hand side there, you've got the Niger, which is a few chairs, a screen, and a blank. And so, to me, it's very uncomfortable that in this UN-managed space that is supposed to be a level playing field, that is particularly supposed to be looking at the most vulnerable, there are these power relationships playing out where the richest countries are able to present themselves and are able to do things that some of the poorer countries simply can't do. Should also point out that these are the pavilions. You've got the USA, you've got Chad in the middle, and then you've got Russia. And you know, the United Convention on Climate Change, nobody's kind of excluded unless you've pulled out of the Paris Climate Agreement, then you will be there. I must admit, I didn't dare to go into the Russian pavilion. This was slightly strange because the pavilions they're like those pubs that you're not supposed to go into and open the door and everybody goes quiet. It was quite weird at Dubai because each country had one of these buildings with this kind of frosted glass to everyone's. It wasn't quite as open and accessible because you might want it to be. But what goes on inside the pavilions? Well, this is the UK pavilion at COP29 in Azerbaijan. You can see a Miliband there. So, for example, in the pavilions, you might get ministers coming along, or sometimes prime ministers making announcements, talking about all the great things that they're doing. Also hosting debates, hosting panel discussions about what the UK energy policy is, where they're going, good things, sharing information, holding each other to account, etc. So there's some quite good meaty things goes on in the pavilions. It's also sometimes just not very much at all. This is an example of a non-governmental organisation. World Health Organization would have a pavilion. WWF would have a pavilion. Then you've got various indigenous groups as well who have pavilions. So, there's these activities going on there. The Zodian Hub, for example. And then there's like groups of countries will have pavilions together as well. So this is what's called the V20, the vulnerable 20. So the UN have drawn a list of 20 countries the most vulnerable to climate change. So they have a space where they can get across what their concerns are and what they're doing about it. So it's this amazing kind of exhibition where you can wander around and see things. And this is a pavilion where I would do most of my kind of lobbying on science stuff. It's called the cryosphere, and it's usually sponsored by some countries who have a vested interest in preserving the cryosphere, right? So probably mountain countries, Switzerland, Chile, Iceland are very heavily involved. So they will actually provide some funds to set up a cryosphere pavilion, which is then run by an NGO called the International Cryosphere Climate Initiative, which is run by a former US diplomat. And the idea is that we use the cryosphere science to try and raise ambition and encourage action. We try and talk about the stuff that I've talked about today to you in these venues and hope that the policymakers are listening. So, we might do press release or talks in the cryosphere pavilion, trying to get information across to people. Let's face it, they don't read any of our papers, but actually at COP, we can turn up and we can actually tell them. Sometimes you can build relationships with countries and particularly negotiators who then might ask for briefing notes. They might say, I'm going into the negotiations this afternoon. I wanted to say something about the Paris Agreement and what it might mean for sea level rise. Could you write some notes for me to take into those negotiations? So we will work alongside countries who are interested in taking the science and using it in negotiations. And you never know who's going to wander by in these pavilions. That's what the president wanders by. You can always tell them the VIP. Everybody else at COP has got a bag or carrying something on a coat. Obviously, you can tell when it's a president or a prime minister because they've never carried. Anyway, that's a small point. So then, what goes on in side events? Talked about side events. These are not the negotiations. These might be private equity. Okay, so actually on stage, that is Bill Gates there, and there's a few other people. That's former Prime Minister David Cameron, and they're talking about adaptation finance in Africa. So there are a space, a lot of stuff about finance at the moment. So jump out to us in the world. So there'll be lots of kind of information sharing. Look what we're doing, and here's what's available. We just tripled our adaptation finance. We're providing benefits. We're investing in Uganda. There's lots of kind of posturing and information sharing and networking that's supposed to go on in these side events. Al Gore, you may or may not remember Al Gore, former US Vice President. He was a huge champion of kind of climate science, climate change 20 odd years ago. He's still doing the rounds, giving very inspirational talks about stuff. And various celebrities occasionally turn up as well and do things. But what we're there to do really as scientists, as an observer, but also to try and shape things. We'll run side events where we're trying to kind of get across the latest science post IPCC report. So this was a side event we ran at 1.5 degrees, and the powers of ignoring science typically went to pricing. And there's various panel discussions. But we also produce this, like a bunch of scientists, in advance of each conference, a video release. It's like a very accessible pamphlet that gives you all the latest information you want to know about melting ice. That's something that we're working on. And of course, there's lots of media activities. These things, most international media organisations are there. They're reporting on it. And then there'll be press releases. So this is Keir Starmer at COP29, and he was announcing the UK's new what's called nationally determined contribution, which is what you're pledged to say, this is our NDC, this is what we're going to do. Our target is to try and reach net zero by 2050. So various countries will make these big announcements at the COPs, take questions from the media, etc., etc. And I will say that the UK is very much, ahead of the game. This compared to a lot of other countries. And there's more media events and side events and stuff. But of course, the really meaty stuff goes on in the negotiations, right? So this is where all the action takes place. You can see the various countries are taken out in alphabetical order, and this is where the negotiation will take place. Now, as an observer, I'm not allowed to intervene in most of the negotiation tracks. There's multiple negotiation tracks where they're trying to encourage action. It might be about finance, it might be about science. It might be about NDCs, it might be about just transition. So there's lots of different negotiation tracks, and there'll be specialist negotiators in each of those. But as observers, we just sit at the back, and we're not allowed to speak up. There are some negotiations when we are allowed to submit written questions, and there are some sessions that are specifically to inform observers for them to raise concerns and issues around the COP. Essentially, we just kind of watch things unfold, and we see there's protocols about a rain badge at the top when you want to speak. Chairs have a big thing at the front, a big list of countries, and they go through them. And most of the time, you've only got 2 minutes to make your point. So I don't think you can just ramble on for half an hour. There is a time limit. And what sometimes happens are these things called huddles. So usually you might speak up on behalf of your country. More often than not, you'll speak up on what's called on behalf of the negotiating bloc. So it'll be very rare for, say, Germany just to say, well, Germany thinks this, right? It would actually be Germany speaking on behalf of the EU, but all of a sudden you've got all that weight behind you. So there are very complicated negotiating blocks, which I'll come on to in a minute. But rarely do you speak up to your own national interests. So what happens is occasionally somebody like Germany might say something, and the rest of the EU think, hang on, I can't say that. So they'll ask the chair, can we just go outside and have a chat amongst ourselves? That's called a huddle. People say that this is where actually a lot of real work can be done. And actually, some people say that huddles were actually integral and vital to the Paris Climate Agreement getting over the line, where people left the room, went outside, fleshed it out. But you can see there's all kinds of inequalities playing out here. The big people with the loudest voices are dominating the discussion, except for the edge not really listening. So there's all kinds of strange things go on with these huddles, but it is a real thing that pops. And you can even Google huddle at COPs and you can read about some of the famous huddles over the years. But anyway, that's what goes on. But in the negotiations, you'll often have people sat around, various countries sat around the table, and it is as nitty gritty as having the draft text on the screen in a Word document with people making changes to the text. We don't agree with that sentence, can we take it out, can we put it in brackets, come back to it later. But they are literally fighting over words at this point. And it gets quite dry and quite legal. And the big problem is it's done by consensus. So absolutely everybody has to agree some final text. Otherwise, you don't reach an agreement, which is why I think it's amazing that we got the Paris Climate Agreement. So here's an example of some draft text that was agreed in draft informal negotiations on the 12th of November. And I was in these negotiations listening to what's going on. Look at these strange things in red. You've got countries saying that 2025 is not positive record. Well, yeah, that's fine. We showed a graph earlier. Interesting that some countries want that text in there. But why do they want a half sentence saying that 2025 wasn't a positive record? Why do they want a little bit of red text there saying that sea level rise rate decline in 2025? Which again is technically true, but against the long-term increase, what's going on here? Yeah, there are countries trying to get things in here. But the nice thing is they clearly listed some of the science, noted with concern irreversible change in the biosphere. Talked about those earlier. Led to glacier and sea ice loss, including complete loss of glaciers in 2 countries, with related impacts including sea level change. So this is the kind of draft text, and then just 3 days later, that paragraph changed to that. So 3 days of negotiations went from that chunky bit. The good news is we lost some of those rather obscure kind of like trivia we read. But all we have now about the biosphere and sea level rise is we know the need to enhance observation and address gaps in the monitoring of the biosphere, which I think is so frustrating. We don't need more information. We don't need to address knowledge gaps. We've got all the science that we need. So this is what goes on at COPs. The text gets diluted. This is really frustrating. Some of us actually wrote many of the conversations. The media thing. We actually got so annoyed. We wrote an article about the fact that the Earth's frozen regions, the biosphere is sending a clear message, but politicians are still ignoring it. But it's not all of it. It's literally just a few countries. It just takes one country to speak up. The UK's the lead negotiator. We're deeply concerned that we weren't able to highlight the role of the IPCC as the best area science, or that it was possible to capture those scientific observations instead of wider, etc., etc. So lots of countries speaking out, calling out the other countries, saying, "Come on, this is not fun," and this is really ramping up now. Actually, there is certain very small minority of countries that are kind of seeking to dilute the science and obfuscate. So just to end, what actually happened at the last COP? You might recall COP30 was billed as the COP of truth. There were hopes for a roadmap to guide a planned and just transition away from fossil fuels, and other hopes for a roadmap to kind of stop deforestation. But this is why it was held in Berlin, to raise ambition around the Amazon rainforest. The other thing that was really hoped at COP was that countries would submit more ambitious NDCs, those nationally determined, individually country determined contributions. This is what we're going to contribute to greenhouse gas emissions. This is the efforts we're making to try and reach that zero. 95% of them we've missed that one. So some of them announced it, at COP. The majority still haven't been announced their new NDCs. But although it was billed as the COP of truth, the BBC described it as one of the most divisive COPs in modern times. So let's think about what was achieved. There was a really good it's a bit complicated, a mechanism to help ensure a just transition away from fossil fuels. Okay, now what that, I'm going to really simplify this, so forgive me, but essentially what they're saying is we need to reduce our reliance on carbon, but we can't do that at the expense of vulnerable communities. So if you are, for example, a coal miner in an African country, then as we transition away from coal, you're not just going to be, left in poverty. There will be a mechanism in place, that we finance in place to support the most vulnerable, recognizing that as we make this transition, some people might get left behind, but we can't have that. We can't just, we can't solve this problem, but create other problems. So it has to be just. This transition away from fossil fuels has to be just. There was a new goal to triple adaptation finance by 2035, somewhat a bit earlier, but that was a kind of goal. There was renewed effort to target the 1.5 Paris Agreement. This was good news, right? This could have been read different ways. It's the first COP where people stood up and said, we're going to miss 1.5. We're now in what we call overshoot territory. But we must keep our focus on 1.5. We've got to look to come back down to it after we've gone through this overshoot. So this, I thought, was significant. It's the first time I've seen people stand up and say, we're now in overshoot territory. I used to say, even just one COP ago, we're still aiming for 1.5, let's keep 1.5 alive. We can still do this. And now people are saying, okay, it's gone. We've kind of known that for quite a few years, but this is the first time it's been publicly stated by negotiators. But the good news is that there was nobody there calling for like, well, okay, we've missed that, so let's just refocus on 2 degrees instead. Instead, people are very much firmly on keeping 1.5 to the target. And despite some early support for roadmap to phase out fossil fuels, it was dropped from the text at the last minute, and there is no mention of fossil fuels at all in the draft text. And instead, it was replaced with this very, very voluntary plan to transition away from fossil fuels. I think Colombia were given the task of setting up a little kind of working group to go away and look at this. This was a real problem. We only have to go back to Glasgow COP26. We actually had wording in there around phasing out fossil fuels, which again was dropped out. And each COP, we want to strengthen that language. It's not happening. This is really frustrating. Now, this is crazy. There was confusion over which countries actually wanted to block that roadmap. And there was really strong support from the EU, UK, and then you've got to go into all these crazy ILAC, AOSIS, that's the Alliance of Small Island States. These are acronyms of the alphabet soup, I'm afraid. But you can see down here, these are all the different AOSIS is the Alliance of Small Island States. The EIG is the environmental integrity. Now you can't, I don't need to take every information from that map. What that map shows you is the Venn diagram to be all Venn diagrams. Each country is written down once, but you can see it belongs to different negotiating groups. So if I were to just jump in and pick Venezuela, which is there, well, they're part of OPEC with these countries, but they're also a like-minded developing country, which is part of this group. They also fall within the G77 in China, which is this group. So this is the problem, because each of these negotiating groups will tend to want to give a unified stance on a particular issue. What happened with this fossil fuel roadmap is that big blocks like the G77 in China might say we oppose it, but actually a lot of countries within the G77 in China said, no, we do actually fully support together, but we were given a chance to speak up in our own coordination. So it gets incredibly complicated because countries span more than one of these negotiating groups. It's fair to say that it was largely blocked by what are called like-minded developing countries, the Arab group, and the least developed countries. They were the people, and it was all about finance. It was all about, we will absolutely transition away from fossil fuels, but you're going to have to provide the finance for us to do. But I think that's very understandable. But a lot of this comes down to money finance, which is why we have to get that. So just to finish, the final cover decision, this is on the summary of the whole of the COP, has these very kind of dry legal sentences about recognising the limits of levels of 1.5. But it was good because it is still focused on 1.5. There was a danger it could have been reset to 2 degrees, but there is still a focus on 1.5. But this is the kind of language you see. You know, underscores the risks of climate change will be much lower at 1.5 than at 2. So this was all really good because there was, as I said, a danger. Other stuff here, acknowledging the significant collective progress towards the Paris Agreement. Well, we had a discussion about that. From an expected temperature increase of more than 4 degrees. So they're acknowledging that there has been some good come from COPs, etc., etc. And, you know, some rather vague sentences about things that happen too slowly. And actually, it was a really nice analysis by carbon. It's just a really good source of information about climate negotiations. If you look at all those words like recognises, recalls, acknowledges, decides, 69 inactive verbs compared to 32 active verbs. So actually, you know, you could argue a lot of this stuff, you know, you're going to recognise things as well. But I'm afraid this is the language we do, which again makes it amazing that we've got the Paris Agreement over the line. So we'll look ahead in hope. COP31, after all, will be in Turkey. Australia are going to run the show. Got that one out. But one of the significant things that was agreed at COP actually is that COP32 will be in Ethiopia, and that's the first least developed country opposed to population. That would bring a focus on some of the issues around kind of justice and just transition into the right. So I hadn't actually answered the question I posed at the beginning. Can climate negotiations stop sea level rise? Unfortunately, no. It's not kind of over the next few centuries. Policymakers should prepare for that, several meters, I would say. But we still have agency to determine how fast and how high. I would argue that slowing sea level rise, not stopping it, even just slowing it, requires the global mean temperature cooling today. And then actually stopping sea level rise altogether takes several months. So this is something that we are doing. I'll finish there. Thank you very much. I'll take a few more questions. Yeah. Yep. But yeah, there is, yeah, so you're absolutely right. The financial exclusion. I think, if you're a small, poor country, then you just don't have the resource to send a negotiator. The UK would probably send just 100 people to a COP, right? Just there to do work to negotiate. Other countries might just have 2 negotiators, so they're not even present in some of the negotiations. I will say, just on the language thing, there are, believe it or not, 6 official UN languages, and everything is interpreted live. So those 6 UN, everything is translated to those 6 UN languages. But yeah, no, I think there are well publicized issues around the inequalities that play out in these countries. I mean, you saw something in just of the structures there. In the negotiations, I do think there is a sense, when I sat in them and witnessed them, I think there is a sense that people are being listened to in the negotiations. It's more what they're saying, right? So you might get 10 the least developed countries all say the same thing, and then you get the EU saying, "I'd like to support my colleagues, we couldn't agree with that." And then another country will come along, and Russia, the Netherlands say, "Sorry, you've got these fantastic competition." And they will talk to each other in the corridors, and there'll be some lobbying, things going on. But actually, it is very level, and the chairs do a very good job in the negotiations of everybody gets involved. It's not like those people always get to talk and they're not getting a chance. It's very even changing. Sorry, I'll just repeat the question. The question was about kind of the absence of the USA and whether that makes a difference in terms of, does that mean people can now start to push things through that they might have objected to, and also are other countries stepping up? I think the USA thing, again, I think if you read around it and you speak to people, it goes 2 ways. Some people say this is a catastrophe, but, their own emissions are very high. This isn't going to help. They were on a little bit of a path to try and reduce them previously. That's not going to help. There's also a danger that other countries copy them. So, there was I think it's the last but one COP, Argentina didn't turn up, perhaps because there's some alliance there with the US. The flip side is that there's a lot of regulation in the US that takes place at the state level. And actually, you'll see governors of states turning up and saying all the amazing things that they're saying. So actually, the federal government doesn't have any control over what we're doing in California. We're rolling out this, we're doing this, we're doing that, etc., etc. So, and this whole kind of fear mongering around the USA not being involved is actually overblown. The rest of the world's going in a different direction. If they choose not to be involved, that's their problem. And on that note, very briefly, China is a country that has really stepped up to fill a gap. In terms of the what they're doing through their own nationally determined contributions and setting very ambitious goals, but also in actually positioning themselves as a world leader in things like renewables and batteries, etc. And China, used to be obstructing things 10 years ago, and now are either silent, which is okay, or actually speaking very much about and are doing amazing things. And you'll see a lot of good coverage on the Carbon Brief website with a stat around all the good things that China do. So I do think there are other countries that see this as an opportunity to step in and do some really good things. Yep. Yeah, yeah. Sure, I can repeat that for people online, but there was a question about the UK position, and then there was somebody who's been involved in negotiations talking about the frustrations that they came to agree on the lack of finance. I mean, it's interesting. I mean, I do think the UK and Ed Miliband are doing, really good stuff, but they're getting absolutely outperformed by the other politicians. It is so twisted, and I think what you read in the media is like these bonkers is making out things, it's jobs, the UK is going to go. But actually, it's the right thing to do from a climate perspective. It's about making decisions now that will benefit future generations. But actually, human beings are just rubbish about actually being unselfish and thinking about other people rather than themselves over those timescales. So the problem is that a lot of it boils down to political timescales. What will keep so much in the house? I think the UK and the Labour government have been very ambitious around climate, but they get some regularly a lot of stick. You mentioned the ocean dialogue as well. That's I think that might follow a little bit. So there are different negotiation tracks. I tend to what's called the research and systematic observation, the RSO, and links across the ocean dialogue as well. They're some of the more drier negotiations in the sense that they're there to be informed about the science and make decisions based on the best of evidence science, but it's not always listened to. And then I think you spoke very eloquently about some of the frustrations that I think a lot of people share about different groups not being able to agree on things. And I think I think COPs can be very disheartening. You go there full of energy and excitement and hope, and everything kind of gets broken down to the lowest kind of very briefly you mentioned finance, and I completely agree that finance that's being made available nowhere near the to make that transition rate possible. I probably didn't answer your question really well.